Alright, time for chapter 22. So chapter 22 is all about the respiratory system and dealing with physiology of it. For example, for your inspiration and expiration, so you're inhaling or exhaling, and all of the components that go with gas exchange. So for breathing or pulmonary ventilation, it's repetitive cycling of inspiration, also known as inhaling or intaking air, and expiration or exhaling or breathing out air. So a respiratory cycle is one complete inspiration or breathing in and expiration and breathing out. Normally, while you're at rest, you're undergoing quiet respiration where you're not even thinking about your breathing. You're just normally bringing air in and out of your lungs. For forced respiration, is this where you have more deep breathing or rapid breathing, where you have additional support to help bring air into your lungs as well as help push air out of your lungs. So the principles that govern airflow are pressure and resistance. So the flow of your air depends on the differences in pressure between the air that is inside the lungs as well as the air that's outside your body. So in order to do this, your respiratory muscles will change the volume in the lungs, which causes your differences in pressure. So again, the principles that govern airflow are pressure and resistance. So for resistance, which won't be covered in this video, resistance is just the obstruction of air either in or out. So for example, when your bronchioles constrict, that restricts airflow through and increases the resistance, which decreases airflow. Or if your lungs are scarred and lack the elasticity in them. So for example, if like an old balloon that doesn't stretch like it used to, then your lungs won't stretch like they should. So going back to pressure, air, just like blood, flows from areas of higher pressure to lower pressure. And this is done in the lungs by changing their volume. So your diaphragm is the prime mover of respiration. So it's your primary respiratory muscle to help to adjust the volume in your lungs. So when your diaphragm, which is the muscle that is highlighted in purple, when it contracts, it flattens. So instead of being in this weird umbrella-looking shape, it flattens when it contracts, which helps to enlarge the thoracic cavity and therefore pulling air into the lungs. During relaxation, the diaphragm bulges back up, so it goes back into its more umbrella-like shape, which then compresses the lungs and helps to push air out. So to model how this is done, I have a bell jar model of the lungs. So our little flattened balloons are our deflated lungs, and the latex at the bottom is representative of the diaphragm. So when the diaphragm contracts or flattens, it causes the air to move into the lungs, and then when it relaxes, the air flows out of the lungs. So a cheap way to do this at home is to use a top of a 2-liter bottle, still have our balloon to represent our lung, except for now we only have one balloon. And then for our diaphragm at the bottom, just a regular plastic bag from a grocery store works. Then just seal it around the end of that 2-liter bottle, so the top of it, with your balloon stretching over the top here. So grabbing a piece of it, we have our flattened balloon. When our diaphragm has relaxed, diaphragm contracts, which flattens it, so fills air into the lungs. relaxes again when it relaxes again, which causes the air to flow out. So contract, relax, contract, relax. So surrounding your lungs are two membranes that work together. You have your visceral pleura on the inside that actually makes contact with your lung, and the parietal pleura on the outside of on the outermost layer that makes contact with your rib cage. So your job of the pleura is to protect your lungs from abrasion, since they're shoved up in the chest along there with the heart. So as the lungs are moving and your heart are moving, it keeps that abrasion from those organs from rubbing against each other. So with these two layers, in between them is another area called your pleural cavity. Your pleural cavity is filled with pleural fluid. So this helps with just normal lung function, just from its not moving air in or out, because your lungs are kind of like a balloon and they're elastic, and so they're more like they tend to draw inward. However, your visceral pleura, so on the outside in red, making contact with your ribs as well as other external surfaces. So for example, the diaphragm makes contact at the bottom of your parietal pleura. That contact with these other structures pulls outward on the lungs. So what this causes is an area of negative pressure in between the two membranes. So this pull out combined with the pull in of the lungs, the negative pressure helps to pull out on the lungs, so to help keep your lungs from collapsing. Also, with functioning of your lungs, when your diaphragm and other muscles that work to expand the thoracic cage, when they pull, they'll pull on the parietal pleura. This pleural cavity makes the contact with the visceral pleura on the inside that actually contacts the lungs. This causes these two membranes to stick together, so when the parietal pleura gets pulled, then the visceral pleural gets pulled. So when the visceral pleural gets pulled, it also pulls the lungs with it, and that's what changes the lungs volume. So pulling on the lungs, when you have expansion of your thoracic cavity, so increasing the volume, pulls air into the lungs, and then when those muscles press onto the lungs, so pressing against that parietal pleura, which then also presses against the lungs, drives air out of the lungs. So you go from pull on the lungs, increasing its volume, which lowers its pressure, driving air into the lungs, and then pushing on to the parietal pleura, and therefore the rest of the structures, which causes a compression of the lungs, decreasing its area, driving air out of the lungs. So a simplified version of looking at this is just looking at boxes of air. So on the left, you have a box that has higher pressure due to the small volume it has, so the air molecules don't have as much room to move around in, so therefore having a higher pressure. So by increasing the volume, so for increasing the volume of the lungs, the air molecules that are in the lungs have more space to move around so that they're under lower pressure. So this drives the higher pressure air from the atmosphere into the lungs. So the opposite is true when you compress the lungs, therefore creating more pressure in that same amount of area, which therefore would drive the air molecules out of the lungs from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure than the outside environment. So once the air has been drawn into the lungs, it reaches the structures, or called your alveoli, so these little air sacs that are located at the end of your bronchial tree. So the lighter beige looking side, there's your alveoli side, and then over here is your capillaries. So your alveoli are surrounded by baskets of capillaries where they allows for a large amount of surface area where they can exchange gases. So this is exchanging of gas across that respiratory membrane. So in order to do this, you have air that you've breathed in, which has a higher concentration of oxygen, which drives the air to go from a higher partial pressure of oxygen in your alveoli to diffuse across the respiratory membrane to the area of lower partial pressure oxygen in your capillaries. Vice versa for your carbon dioxide, going from a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the capillaries, so from the carbon dioxide that's picked up from the body, and it is driven across the respiratory membrane to an area of lower partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli. So for water to get from the drier alveoli environment to inside the blood, which is completely liquid, it first must be dissolved in water. So the surface area of your alveoli is covered in a thin film of water, so that oxygen is dissolved into the water, which allows it to fuse across the respiratory membrane and into the blood. For your carbon dioxide, it's already dissolved in your blood plasma, so it's able to just easily diffuse across the respiratory membrane and dissolve into the water that's there, and then be released out into the alveolar air. So during systemic gas exchange, where you unload the oxygen that you've breathed in and load carbon dioxide from the tissues, the partial pressures of your oxygen going from your inspired air or breathed in air, so partial pressure of your oxygen and carbon dioxide change as you go through your entire system. So making different changes, for example, a dramatic increase in the partial pressure of your carbon dioxide by the time the air reaches your alveoli, because they mix with the leftover gas from the last gas exchange, as well as exchanging carbon dioxide from the deoxygenated blood. The alveolar air has a lot higher concentration of carbon dioxide. So as you go through your exchange of your oxygen and carbon dioxide, so unloading your oxygen and loading up your CO2, your pressures change as you go through the system. But when you go back to your lungs, so here we have our deoxygenated blood, which has a partial pressure of about 40 millimeters of mercury. But by that time, that deoxygenated blood goes back into the alveoli and mixes with the air that has been breathed in. Its oxygen pressure has greatly increased, so now we're up to 116 millimeters of mercury. So limited difference between your inspired air partial pressure for oxygen and your expired or breathed out air partial pressure for oxygen. So this allows your expired air to be safely used as a rescue breath during CPR, where you have enough oxygen in your expired air to be able to give the person enough air to continue their breathing. So inside your blood, your oxygen is mostly bound to hemoglobin, so that globular protein with the heme moiety in the center with the iron at the center of it. The oxygen is majority bound to hemoglobin, so that molecule, and then the rest is dissolved in plasma. For your carbon dioxide, most of it, so 90%, is hydrated to form carbonic acid, and that's how most of your carbon dioxide is transported in the blood. That carbon dioxide, once your carbon dioxide has been transformed into carbonic acid, it dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. The rest of your carbon dioxide is either bound to proteins, so proteins that are in the plasma itself, or bound to the globin portion of hemoglobin. So the oxygen binds to the heme portion. The globin portion has your CO2. So your hemoglobin can actually transport both oxygen and CO2 at the same time, since they're not competing for the same space. So the reaction of your CO2, once it enters into a red blood cell, the carbon dioxide is carbon dioxide and water, so the hydration of carbon dioxide forms your carbonic acid, which then dissociates in the cell to bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So here's the reaction again. So carbonic acid dissociating into your bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ions. So this reaction to combine your carbon dioxide and water is helped along by the carbonic anhydrase enzyme that's inside your red blood cells. These help to catalyze that reaction to change your carbon dioxide and water into your carbonic acid. So after your carbonic acid has dissociated into your bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion, the hydrogen ion goes and binds to your hemoglobin molecule. Your bicarbonate ion is involved with chloride shift. So it's an antiport exchange where the bicarbonate ion is exchanged for a chloride ion. So the bicarbonate ion leaves the red blood cell, and chloride ions are taken into the blood cells. Then lastly, so just again, your hydrogen ion binds to hemoglobin. That helps to maintain pH, since free hydrogen ions in your red blood cell would increase its pH and would decrease the pH and make it more acidic. So looking at everything all together in systemic gas exchange, so unloading your oxygen and loading up carbon dioxide into the blood. So a small amount of your carbon dioxide enters into the capillary blood and stays as a dissolved carbon dioxide gas. Some of your carbon dioxide is diffused across that diffuses into the capillary blood, either binds to a plasma protein, making a carb amino compound, or binding to hemoglobin, forming still a type of carb amino compound, but it's a carboxy hemoglobin. So the carbon dioxide with the hemoglobin, with carbon dioxide bound to a hemoglobin. The rest of your carbon dioxide diffuses into a red blood cell, which then gets hydrated into carbonic acid through the carbonic anhydrase enzyme. Then this carbonic acid then dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ion then binds to a oxyhemoglobin molecule. So binding to that molecule helps the hemoglobin loosen from the oxygen molecule, and therefore helping with oxygen being diffusing out of the cell, out of the capillaries, and into your tissues. For the bicarbonate ion, it undergoes chloride shift, so your bicarbonate ion is sent out of the cell, your chloride ion is brought back in. And then the rest of your oxygen is just a dissolved gas that diffuses into the tissues. So the opposite happens in alveolar gas exchange, so gas exchange in the lungs. So your CO2 is unloaded. So you go through a reverse chloride shift to bring bicarbonate ions back into the red blood cell. So you undergo a backwards reaction to going from your bicarbonate ion and your hydrogen ions. When the oxygen releases off the hemoglobin, it also releases its affinity for hydrogen. So these two molecules will then combine together again to form your carbonic acid. Then your carbonic acid then separates into your water molecule and your carbon dioxide. So that carbon dioxide can then be released out of the cell and released into the alveoli to be breathed out or exhaled. So picture version, so here in the gray we have the lungs or the cells of your alveoli, so your air sacs. So some of your carbon dioxide is just dissolved CO2 gas in your capillary blood, so it just diffuses across the respiratory membrane. For your carbamino compounds, so your carbon dioxide to a protein, bound to a protein compound, the carbon dioxide is released from that since you have higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the capillary blood and less partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveolar air, so driving that carbon dioxide to the alveoli. And then most of it comes from the reverse of that carbonic acid equation, as well as for your oxygen, so high oxygen, partial pressure in the alveoli, driving oxygen to lower oxygen, partial pressure in the capillary blood. So in your red blood cells, most of your oxygen binds to hemoglobin, which when your hemoglobin binds to oxygen, then releasing that hydrogen ion, helping to go back to your bicarbonate ion to recreate your carbonic acid, and then that carbonic anhydrase enzyme helps to convert your carbonic acid back into carbon dioxide and water, allowing for the partial pressure difference to drive carbon dioxide into your lungs. And then the last, that is just dissolved O2 gas or oxygen, just driven again by partial pressure differences. So that's it for chapter 22. Again, if you have questions, message me, and I'll see you next time.